It was 3 a.m. when Maria saw her. The mansion sat like a polished tooth against the night, glass and limestone, a pale rectangle of light in an otherwise sleeping street. The lawn, which by day looked manicured and harmless, was a cold field of dew under the porch lamps. Maria had come out to put the garbage at the curb, an ordinary chore she had done for the family for nearly a decade, when something small and still on the grass caught her eye. A child, curled forward as if trying to fold herself into less of a presence, in thin pajamas that did nothing against the damp night. Maria paused a breath away, the smell of her own soap on her hands. The house felt very far away then, as if the walls themselves were full of gears and decisions that had nothing to do with a girl shivering on the lawn. The girl's eyes were open. She looked at Maria with a kind of exhausted patience you see in people who have learned early how little the world will necessarily do for them. "Please," the girl whispered, and her voice was a thread. She locked me out. That single sentence, small, literal, raw, cut through the neatness of the street and rebounded inside Maria like a bell. The words made the mansion change before her eyes. Satin curtains and polished countertops turned into a place with locked doors and carefully arranged secrets. Maria felt, in the sudden flare of obligation that had pulled her from bed at odd hours before, the slow gathering of a decision she could not unmake. She wrapped the girl in her cardigan without thinking about her own tiredness. The fabric was thin, but it was warmth enough for the moment. The girl's shoulders were bone-soft under the cloth. She smelled faintly of something flowery, someone's perfume that had drifted onto a child, and something else under it, the metallic sourness of hunger that did not come from an empty stomach alone. Maria's name had been on a dozen house lists in her life. Cleaner, laundress, someone who made other people's houses ready for the day. She was used to seeing what people left behind. Crumbs on a sofa, a child's forgotten shoe, a receipt folded into a drawer. She was not used to finding a child medically small in substance and yet large with unspoken stories. This was different. They went back up to the house because there was no other place to go. Maria knew the rhythm of the mansion, the back door that only opened with a code, the foyer that smelled of lemon polish, the pictures on the wall that featured smiling faces posed like advertisements. Inside, the adopted daughter. She would be introduced to the world in newswire language as the billionaire's adopted daughter, though here she remained simply a trembling presence, sat on the edge of a sofa and watched Maria with an expression that was almost practiced in caution. "You'll be cold out there," Maria said. She tried for a voice that could be simple. No condemnations, no assumptions. The girl nodded once and hugged the cardigan around herself as if it were shelter. Maria kept glancing at the staircase where an expensive light fixture threw neat shadows. In the kitchen, there were plates wrapped in cling film as if someone had been staging an immaculate life for a visitor. In the child's small hallway, a row of toys sat in a line so straight they might have been placed for display. Someone who hosted guests would not let a doll look askew. Someone who wanted the right public image practiced domestic order as if it were a virtue. She learned the girl's name later. She preferred to call her simply the adopted daughter at first, because naming felt like taking ownership of someone else's pain. For now, Maria thought only of what the girl had said. "She locked me out." The sentence pressed insistently on a series of questions. Who? Why? How often? Maria had her own life peopled with obligations that had nothing to do with the mansion. She had 2 children, Rodrigo and Isabella, who waited for her at home in an apartment that had seen better ceilings and smaller electric bills. She worked long hours, carried bags heavier than she let on, and kept a calendar of smiles for people who paid on time and forgot names by Monday. Speaking up in a household like this was not only a moral risk, it was a livelihood risk. Maria had seen how quickly someone could be replaced. She calculated that speaking up might cost her job, her income, the quiet dignity of a known routine. She counted the cost in a few heartbeats and found the number unacceptable. The first thing she did was simple. She made tea in a chipped cup and sat beside the child on the sofa, close enough so her shoulder brushed the girl's, and asked nothing more than the small things that let a frightened person believe they would be heard. The girl's hair was silky at the ends, but tangled at the crown, as if she had been running a hand through it all night. She had a bruise along her forearm that looked faded and old, not fresh injury, but an echo. When she drew her hand over the mark, it flinched in a way that said the memory of pain lived more surely than the mark itself. Maria did not push. She unfolded the concern into a slow, steady attention. "Are you hungry? Can you tell me what happened? Where do you sleep?" The girl answered in small sentences. She spoke of an upstairs room that was almost never used, of meals eaten at odd hours, of being made to stay quiet by a woman's tone that could be very sharp, even when her face had powder and light. She said that the mother, Gabriella, whose name Maria had heard, trotted out at parties and philanthropic galas, was at times distant in a way that looked like disdain rather than preoccupation. The father, Henrique, was a presence that hummed farther away, in boardrooms and in press statements. This was gossip Maria had held back from for years, heard through the clipped conversations of household staff, through the way the nanny's laughter ended in a new hush. But it was not gossip now. It was the quiet reveal of a particular night. The girl's hand, when she moved to her pocket, found a small notebook folded and tucked away. It was childish in size, but not in content. The pages were filled with drawings that looked at first glance as if drawn by a child. A house rendered as a square, a stick figure with a smile, a sun in the corner. But the lines were heavy in places, and the images repeated a single motif over and over. A door, drawn thick and black from the inside. A small figure outside that door, figures of arms closing it. One picture showed a figure with long hair standing tall and a small figure hunched beneath. Maria felt something go numb in her chest. She had cleaned this house for years and had seen children's doodles border the fridge and the inside of drawers. She knew what the casual marks of childhood looked like. These drawings were not about play, they were records. "Why did you draw these?" she asked softly. The adopted daughter's fingers smoothed over the ink. "That's where I stay," she said. "That's the door." There was a care in the girl's language that reminded Maria of her own children saying, years ago, that the shadows under the table were monsters. Here, the monsters had a shape someone could draw and a hand that could be pointed at. Maria made a decision that took less time than fear wanted to suggest. She set the notebook aside in her handbag and folded the cardigan over the girl's knees to warm her. She called the number she knew for Child Protective Services. Her thumb hovered a second over the keypad. She had been in 1,000 quiet calculations in her life. The cost of a school uniform, the rent that would not wait for a late paycheck. But calling that number felt like stepping off a cliff into a weather she could not predict. "Hello?" a woman answered. The voice was professional and tired in the way of people who had to choose empathy again every morning. Maria told the story as she had found it, letting the details live in the telling. The woman on the other end took notes. She promised an evaluation. Maria felt a thin weight of relief. To her surprise, a short time later, a social worker named Carla arrived with a clipboard and a badge. Carla was efficient and calm and meant the work she did. She wore shoes that made no sound on polished floors, and her eyes were the kind that lingered on hands and faces the way professionals taught them to do. She spoke with the adopted daughter gently, asked the child about her daily routines, about where she slept. She also spoke with Gabriella, who arrived like a constellation of preparation, pressed skirt, deliberate smile, an apology already polished for any inconvenience. Gabriella's voice was the voice people used when they needed to be believed. There was an evaluation that went through the proper motions. Carla checked the girl's height and weight against records, made lists on her pad, asked about medical history. Gabriella explained that the child had had a night alone by mistake, that a nanny had been sent home, that tempers flared and doors had been closed in a moment of stress, that everything had been resolved. The scene in the foyer looked exactly like the kind of domestic mishap that legal forms are made to explain away, a logistical error multiplied by a household's human flaw. Carla was courteous, but also bound by rules and thresholds. In the end of that first visit, she said, with the careful neutrality of a professional trained to prevent harm without precipitating chaos, that she could not remove custody on the basis of a single night and a child's drawings. She said she would monitor the case and follow up. She asked whether Maria could keep an eye on the child and call again if anything else happened. Maria left the house, feeling the itch of unfinished business under her skin. The social worker had done what she could within the law's constraints and the family's polished statements, but the drawings were not part of a night alone. The bruise was more than an accident. The girl's words were precise. She locked me out. The phrase did not belong in the same folder as bad tempers. It belonged in another file entirely, one that was slippery and heavy and necessary. That night, after Maria had walked back to the bus stop and clutched her badge of work like a talisman, she lay awake and counted the cost. Her children were asleep in a small apartment 2 bus rides away. If she lost her job for speaking up, she thought of scant dinners and apologies for uniforms. If she kept quiet, she thought of the adopted daughter on other nights, locked out again, or left to make less survivable choices. The image that won out was simple. Rodrigo's small palm in hers, his trusts woven from the stories she told at bedtime. She could not permit someone else's child to become an image of what she had failed to prevent. The next morning, she returned to work sooner than she needed to because there was ritual in coming early, in putting order back in a place that itself had lost none. Inside the mansion, routine loosened itself into new discoveries. A lunchbox in the child's room contained fragments of food that suggested irregular meals. A school backpack buried under a cushion held a note torn in 2. Here and there she found the faint outlines of old bruises masked by makeup or clothing. Maria photographed nothing. She had learned against the unspoken rules of the house. Instead, she began to gather small, safe things. A string of hairband, a loose scribbled list where the child had practiced words, the loose notebook page she had not dared show anyone yet. Beatrice arrived the following week like an answer you had no idea you needed. Beatrice was an ex-employee of the house who had left under circumstances that produced small whispers. She delivered laundry to the front gate and paused on the sidewalk to speak to Maria in a hurry of conspiratorial breath. They do not see. Beatrice said, eyes quick and worried. "They are very good at making a show. The lady, she is careful in public, but at home—" Her voice gave the rest away in the way it softened around a painful truth. Beatrice's words were not a confession, so much as a corroboration of a pattern Maria was beginning to stitch together. "I saw her shout once," Beatrice said. "Not when other people were around. I thought it was the small of them. I wash our hands of that house when I can. But the girl was always thin. The ex-employee's presence made things more complicated. She had her own reasons to stay distant. Fear of being dragged back into the household's orbit. A small salary not worth the risk of exposure. But she also carried a testimony that could be useful." Maria felt the weight of how much courage lived in that proffered statement. They found a quiet professional to look at the drawings. Dr. Marcello was someone the house had never hired, a child psychologist who worked out of a small clinic with a coat rack and a kettle that whistled on the boil. He treated each image as data and each child as a subject worthy of the slow work of restoration. He did not make dramatic claims when Maria presented him with a notebook. He did not say what had not been proven. Instead, he explained, in clinical sentences that still felt heavy in the room. Repeated depictions of confinement and of being outside a door were consistent with someone who had experienced exclusion or enforced separation. The heavy lines and dark coloring were markers of fear. The presence of a figure with an authoritative silhouette suggested that the child experienced somebody as a controlling force. "I can't make a diagnosis from pictures alone," Dr. Marcello said. "But these are indicators. They are not proof. They are a call to investigate." His voice was calm and steady. It did not offer certainty, only a channel. Maria felt both relieved and terrified by his restraint. The world of proofs and indicators was not a place that loved certainty. It loved procedure. It required evidence in forms that would hold up when criticized by bright lights and cold pens. The drawings were evidence in a way that could be useful. They would need context, corroboration, and another kind of proof that could not be drawn. Records, witnesses, a camera with a timestamp. It was Jorge, the security technician, who introduced the idea of a camera into the conversation. Maria found him at the small repair shop where he worked on systems that made rich people feel safe and at the margins sometimes showed them otherwise. Jorge had practical hands and an open face, the kind of person who spent his days talking to devices and his nights hearing stories about the things those devices recorded. "They keep footage for a while," Jorge said, outlining logistics as if reading the bone structure of a house. "Sometimes systems overwrite, but there are always ways to pull archived files if they haven't been wiped. You need permission, though, or someone who knows how to access backups." His tone suggested both possibility and risk. He did not embellish the danger of illicit access, but his watchful face showed he knew what was at stake. Maria understood the need for a lawful trail. Carla, the social worker, had told her that any search for recorded material would have to be coordinated through the proper channels, but the knowledge that footage could exist, that a camera might have picked up hands on a door at 2:45 a.m., made a new plan feel possible. It made a path where once there had been only worry. She started to keep a careful log. It was an old habit from her childhood, a way to make sense of survival. Each time she brought the girl a sandwich, she wrote down the hour. Each time the girl mentioned a new inciting phrase, she recorded it verbatim. "She locked me out. I had to sit in the laundry room. I was too small to open the high cabinet." These were small, unremarkable things piled into a dossier that, in her mind, was transforming into something larger and more dangerous to the people who protected neat public faces at any cost. Word spread in small, discreet waves. Maria's neighbors asked perfunctory questions when she came early or left late. Her own children asked fewer worries than she expected. Rodrigo had the stubborn acceptance of children who believe grown-ups can solve everything. Isabella wanted to help make lunches for the adopted daughter, which felt like the right kind of tenderness. At work, the air shifted imperceptibly. A missed instruction, a curt look from a manager, the subtle cooling of invitations, these were the social currency of displeasure. It did not take much for people who had enough to lose to signal distance. Gabriella, the adoptive mother, did what people with power do well. She preserved an image. She posted a photo on a philanthropic page of her hugging the child beneath a banner of charity, with a caption about family love that made Maria's chest tighten for the way it revealed the shapes of public performance. When Maria heard about the post, she felt an immediate urge to respond, to counter the shine with something truer. But she also knew the rules. She could be accused of mischief. She could be accused of jealousy. She could be simply, with a quiet, decisive gesture, dismissed. So she kept going with quieter things. She made lunches. She sat with the girl while she did homework. She found, tucked behind a small dresser, a single mitten damp with tears and scented with powder. She kept these items because they mattered, small breadcrumb evidence of a life that did not fit the glossy brochures about the family. The adopted daughter began to trust Maria in small increments. She told more about the nights that were made of silences and the afternoons where the only voices were soft and clipped. She did not speak in big confessions. Her details were domestic and therefore dangerously credible. The times she was told to stay quiet, the locked door when a visitor came, and the explanation that she was too small to go downstairs. When she laughed, which she did sometimes in a brittle, astonished way at the television, Maria felt the fragile nature of joy being reassembled out of pieces. The first time Maria took one of the notebook pages to Dr. Marcello, the psychologist placed it under a desk lamp and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He indicated that clinical language had a way of protecting the child. He suggested documenting the marks and arranging for a medical exam under the auspices of Child Protective Services. There will be reluctance, he said. There will be people who will argue for the family's stability. You have to be prepared to persist. That word, persist, sat inside Maria like a small stone in her pocket. She had spoken a few times in her life for other people, at town hall meetings for a pothole, during a school meeting when a teacher had complained, to a landlord about leaking ceilings. Each time, persistence had cost her something, a quiet look, an uncomfortable silence at dinner. But this was different. This was someone else's childhood, and the cathedral of public charity built by the family's wealth seemed too grand to allow for error. Carla's follow-up visits grew more frequent at Maria's insistence. She recorded interviews, took measurements, asked for consent for medical evaluations. The first visit to a pediatric clinic produced a report, laced with the clinical tones Maria had been taught to respect. The child was below expected weight for age, with signs suggestive of chronic stress and old bruises consistent with non-accidental trauma. The doctor's handwriting was careful, as if the slant of ink could shield them from accusations. When Maria read the report, she felt a new sort of fear. Not the fearful cost of losing her job, but the frightening possibility that the world could ignore what the paper said. Reports could sit in files. Children could be moved from room to room while little things were cited as reasons to continue custody. She had watched that happen in other lives. She had watched social rituals swallow up hard evidence and leave the child scorched on the other side. The narrative in the staff kitchen that week shifted. She was not merely a cleaner any longer, she was a witness. The mansion's staff treated her differently. Some were cold, others were protective. An older gardener, whose name she barely knew, passed her a small tray of cookies one afternoon and said nothing except a look that meant, "We see." Those glances were a currency more meaningful than conversations. At home, the bills persisted like tides. Maria weighed the scales with a pragmatism she learned from hunger. She planned a conversation with the family's manager to explain that if the situation continued, she would have to step away. She knew how to use negotiation when it was necessary. She also knew how to steel herself for consequences. When she finally confronted the manager with a quiet voice about the child's condition, two things happened in quick succession. First, she was told in a tone that was brief and professional that all employees must trust the privacy of the household and that allegations should be taken through proper channels only. Second, a new, briefer line of contact appeared. The manager's suggestion that Maria simply avoid engagement and let Carla handle it. Both of these were ways of disengaging her moral agency. They were polite ways to say, "Do not trouble the flowing machinery." She did not let them. Maria made one more choice that felt dangerous and right. She asked Jorge, the technician, to check, tangentially and lawfully, whether archived footage from the night could be accessed through official channels. Jorge, who had a practical face, nodded and agreed to look into what was available and how quickly it could be pulled if a social worker or law enforcement requested it. The possibility that there might be a clip, a time-stamped frame showing a hand on a door, a small figure forced outside, was both terrifying and energizing. It meant that something could stand up in court beyond the soft art of testimony. That afternoon, somewhere between the polished opulence of the mansion and the hum of the transit system that would take her home, Maria sat on a bench and folded the notebook's pages again in her hands. She pictured the girl now in a room that smelled of antiseptic and children's shampoo, a safe, provisional place like a warmth given by strangers who meant well. She pictured the other places the child might return to, rooms with locked cupboards and a social script that invited guests and closed its doors. The notebook was a fragile archive of a life being argued over by institutions and people. It had been drawn in ink that bled into the paper like a record that wanted to be found. Maria promised, in a way that surprised her, that she would not stop until the truth had more than the hush of a private apology. She would not be the kind of person who turned away because the cost of speaking up would require new sacrifices. She had, in small acts across years, taught her children that a person's integrity had a price. Now she would pay it. That evening, the adopted daughter ate a plate of food Maria had bought from a small market and sat on the sofa with a softness in her face Maria had never seen in the house's staged photos. She reached for the notebook and drew a new picture. A sun in the corner, a figure inside a door that now had a second figure beside it, tiny hands linking them. It was not yet the end. It was a beginning, drawn by fingers that had learned to hold on. Things tightened after that. The manager called Maria in for a formal conversation. His tone was calm, practiced. He told her, in language meant to be neutral and therefore authoritative, that the family appreciated her loyalty but had concerns. There would be changes to schedules. They were simply optimizing staff. Maria watched his face while he spoke because she wanted to know whether there was a trace of anger beneath his propriety. There was not. There was only the machine of corporate hospitality doing what it had always done, protecting the family's public life from any threats. Maria left the meeting with a letter that said nothing explicit, and yet offered enough to understand her hours were being cut. When she told her children she had less work, Rodrigo shrugged in the way young people do when they have already made a life that expects uncertainty. Isabella asked a single practical thing. Should she bring an extra blanket the next time they came by? Maria answered yes. Practicality was a shape of love. It kept things together. And yet, as hours were cut and a kind of social coolness settled in like dust, word moved beyond the gates. Someone had noticed Maria's persistence. The adopted mother, whose private life had always been careful, posted a curated image of family warmth to deflect rumor. The comments were a tapestry of praise and suspicion. The comment section, as Maria well knew from the tales of other households, had a peculiar violence of its own. You could be forgiven for being human in a room, but you could be excoriated on the internet for seeking safety for a child. That was when the first email arrived, a legal-sounding letter from a law practice representing the family, suggesting that any unwarranted allegations could be defamatory, and that employees should refrain from sharing internal matters publicly. Maria read it twice. Her hands trembled a little, but not because of the threat alone. She felt the geometry of how pressure worked. Money and law were a hedge against exposure. They were the language of adult power. Her next moves were quiet and deliberate. She sent a copy of the notebook to Carla, hand-delivered, and asked for the medical report obtained by the clinic to be placed in the official file. She told Beatriz to prepare her testimony if needed. She asked Jorge to make an initial survey of the security system and report back on whether any footage existed from the night the adopted daughter had slept outside. Jorge responded with a nod and a cautionary smile. There was a possibility of footage, but backups were controlled by corporate IT and accessed under tight protocols. The world in which Maria had been a silent supplier of domestic order had grown louder and more dangerous. She understood that speaking up exposed her to polite threats, the kind that were administered with lawyers and subtle cuts to hours, and to louder, cruder reactions should the family choose to go public. She had already begun to feel the social wedge inside the house. A few small privations, a changed tone, the palpable aura of having rocked something that large people did not like disturbed. The adopted daughter, for her part, began to put words together in a steadier way, not as accusation, but as factual records. She would say, "I was in the hallway," and then, when prompted by Maria, add the detail, "She closed the door." Her voice, while small, was precise. The words were not theatrical, they were necessary. One afternoon, Carla called Maria into the office of the social services building, a low-slung place painted in institutional calm. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Carla sat behind a desk and looked through a folder heavy with notes. She was kind in the way a person trained to hold hard news must be, direct without cruelty. "We have to go by procedure," Carla said. "We can't remove a child lightly. We need evidence that will stand up if challenged. Medical reports, witness statements, anything that helps paint a pattern." She tapped the file to underline the word pattern. "You did the right thing calling us." The sentence should have felt like a closure. It did not. Maria read the professional care as an impetus. It was not permission to stop. It was a mandate to build a case that would not crumble under pressure. For the first time since the night on the lawn, Maria felt the outline of a plan begin to assemble itself with a clarity that steadied her. She would collect more. The girl's clothes for the medical exam, the notebook pages for the psychologist, Beatrice's account for corroboration, and, crucially, any camera records Jorge could help secure through legal requests. She knew the path would be dangerous. She also knew that sometimes the future arrives in a single act, simple, steadfast, and costly. A week later, after a long day when rain had finally come and the mansion's limestone gleamed like a softened place, Maria sat at the edge of the bench in a park and opened her handbag. The notebook slid out, inked edges catching under a faint light. She traced with a fingertip the image of a door and a lonely figure outside. She imagined a different picture, a photograph pulled from a camera with a timestamp, a small frame held up in a room where people were required to be honest by the weight of light and law. That image felt like hope. Jorge called that evening. He had done a quick diagnostic, nothing illegal, nothing beyond what an honest technician could do without stepping over a line. His voice was careful with a sort of technical optimism. There were backups farther up the chain, he said. They might be accessible if the right people requested them. He paused, then added a sentence that made Maria's heart quicken. "But if you ask, I can show you the cameras, so you see what is recorded each night. Sometimes seeing is what helps people believe." It was almost the same as a promise, which meant it was not a promise at all. It was a hinge. Maria arranged to meet Jorge at the small service gate behind the house at dusk. She told no one, because things done in whispers could sometimes be the most honest. The adopted daughter slept that night in a safe room arranged by Carla, an institutional hand of care felt in the softness of blankets and the absence of polished faces. Maria tucked a small note into the girl's pocket. Be brave, be you, and when you can, tell me. It was a trivial thing to say, and yet it was a kind of prayer. When Maria reached the service gate, the world smelled of wet stone and the distant traffic that never slept. She waited in the shadow of a hedge while a car rolled by. Nothing cinematic, nothing heroic. It was a house at night, and a woman with a satchel and an intention. Inside, Jorge opened a maintenance room and switched on a monitor that showed angles of corridors and a fraction of the back lawn. The pictures were grainy in the half-light, no more glamorous than a neighborhood camera's late-night feed. The images wound in loops, showing hours of static nights. Maria felt a tremor in her hands that was half fear and half a brittle hope. "Oh, there," Jorge murmured, pointing to a time-stamped corner. Maria leaned forward until the pixels resolved into the tilt of a hand, a small figure moving at the edge of a frame. The play button paused on a single image, a shadow by the door, a small shape recoiling. Maria's breath was a held thing. She had risked the wages for this. They watched a few more frames, and then Jorge shut down the monitor with a hand that was steady and small. "We need authority to pull the archives," he said. "If it's in there and you want it, you do it through Carla and the right requests. But it's there. I can say that. The certainty of possibility is a strange comfort." It both salved and sharpened the restlessness. Maria left the room feeling as if she carried a small secret thing that could be turned into proof if the right people insisted. She also left knowing that insistence would not be cost-free. Power did not always blink when someone like her demanded visibility. That night, in a small kitchen where the lights were thin and Rodrigo had homework spread on the table, Maria sat and drew a breathing line on a pad of paper. Her children asked few questions. They already knew, from the way life bent in their neighborhood, that courage could be quiet. They ate the second helping of dinner, ate it as if fed by hands that now had other battles. Somewhere above them, in a house of stone and stage, lights burned late, and a woman who wore a reputation like armor stood at a window and peered down into a world she had curated. Maria imagined the polished shelves, the smiling photos, the speeches given at dinners. She imagined, too, the private tone of a door closing, and the small body left outside. The next morning, Maria's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She picked it up with a caution that had been tempered in other seasons of life. The voice on the other end was brisk and precise and hinted at the kind of danger that arrives as a polite warning. "You should stop," it said. "You don't know what you're getting into." The call was short, and the threat was veiled. Maria's heartbeat steadied in a way that had the taste of iron. It was the same feeling she had had the night she first held the girl's hand on the lawn. Something had to be done now that the knowledge existed. Fear was present and yet not decisive. She had thought she would be afraid of losing her job. She had not anticipated how afraid she would be of being ignored. The hollow institutional shrug that signed away a child's urgency. That was the real danger. And so she made a choice to keep moving forward. Carla's voice on the next call was steady and careful. "We can request footage legally," she said. "We can get the medical exam in place. There are steps and I will take them, but the system will push back. Are you willing to persist?" Maria put the phone to her ear and listened to the banal sounds of the city thin through the line. She thought of the tiny, precise things the adopted daughter had said, the way the child had counted nights like beads, and of Rodrigo's small palm in hers. The decision, once made, felt less like bravery and more like an obligation that had been waiting for someone to pick it up. Maria told Carla she was ready to keep pressing. Carla, whose job required a patience that nearly hurt, said the word Maria had already been trying on in her head. Persist. "Before we keep going, tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters in this." Carla formally filed the request to retrieve the archived footage. She explained to Maria, in the same calm she always used with people who had learned to carry grief inside their ribs, that the legal channels could be slow and slippery. Requests for data went up an internal ladder of corporate IT approvals. Legal teams and money could complicate access. But requests were made, subpoenas drafted, and the machinery of oversight began to move. Meanwhile, Jorge continued to be a quiet hinge. He walked the thin, fluorescent-lit corridors of the mansion's maintenance area as if someone else's wealth did not change the weight of the bolts and brackets he handled. He knew the camera placements, the overriding cycles, the habits of technicians who rotated files through storage boxes that sat somewhere in the cloud and sometimes on hard drives. He had already shown Maria a clipped frame that suggested a shadow at the door at 2:45 a.m. He now agreed to cooperate with Carla's formal request and to testify about the existence and integrity of those archives if called upon. The family reacted the way families with means often did when faced with claims that threatened the image they had curated. Gabriella's publicist assembled a line, an official statement about a misunderstanding, a claim of a family moment that had been exaggerated, a promise that the family took the welfare of their children seriously and would cooperate with professionals. Enrique's office crafted a message that acknowledged a distressing incident and emphasized the family's commitment to privacy and to following the law. The language was smooth, designed to close the room where questions could be asked. Privately, the household's manager called Maria in and spoke to her in a voice that tried to sound both reasonable and final. "We appreciate your service," he said, adding words about loyalty and discretion that sounded like a contract. "Sometimes a household like this needs to make adjustments. The implication was clear. Speak less, and your work will continue. Speak more, and the house will find another cleaner." Maria had expected that kind of pressure. She had not expected the coldness that spread through the staff like a lowered temperature. Invitations vanished. The older gardener, who had once offered a tray of cookies, sank his eyes when they crossed in the morning. Beatrice, for all her readiness to corroborate, moved with a protective caution that suggested she would speak only when the right moment arrived. In the small ways that matter inside big houses, Maria started to feel, in the length of a week, more alone. The first formal barrier came at the clinic. The pediatrician's report, careful, clinical, sober, sat in Maria's hands like evidence weighed for a trial. It showed the child's weight under expected percentile, markers consistent with signs of chronic stress, and small healed bruises that a clinician described as old, possibly non-accidental. The language was as gentle as a scalpel. It did not declare motive. It cataloged bodily evidence and psychosomatic responses. Gabriella's legal team pushed hard. They submitted a counterstatement contesting the significance of the clinic notes and suggested that any conclusions at that stage were speculative. They filed requests to view the social services notes and to question the basis of the child's account. Their aim, plainly, was to bog the process in argument and buy time. Time, in their world, was often enough to restore a narrative of normalcy. And then the smear began. At first, it was the curated defense, an elegant philanthropic post with the adopted daughter smiling in warm light, comments praising Gabriella's charity and care. Then, predictably and more destructively, someone leaked a carefully phrased email, an anonymous tip, that suggested Maria had motives beyond the child's welfare. It insinuated that she was seeking attention, that she harbored resentments about her employment. The tone was not violent, it was surgical, a slow erosion of credibility. The hurt came quickest, not from the polished letters, but from the world outside. A local social page reposted the anonymous note and turned it into a question. A few of Maria's friends received trolling messages aimed at the family she kept. Someone left a terse note on her shop's doorway. Traitor. Her hours were shortened further. Once complimentary glances cooled into polite avoidance. Rodrigo asked once, with a child's bluntness, whether people would stop liking her. Maria did not have an answer that would protect him from the real consequences of truth-telling. Raphael, the pro bono lawyer, who had been recommended by a community group, arrived like someone who believed that law could be a shield. He carried with him a folder thick with case law and a practical, blunt confidence. "They will try to bury this," he said to Maria in a low voice. "They will call you dishonest. They will call this a misunderstanding. We prepare for all of that. We take the footage, the psychologist, the medical report, and we make a simple story for a judge. A child at risk. Simpler is often stronger." Raphael's presence changed the tenor of Maria's days. He organized documentation, helped compile the notes she had kept, the entries about times the child was found outside, the small items she had collected, the notebook pages, and formalized requests for Jorge's testimony in the footage. He coached Maria on how to answer questions in ways that would not appear emotional in a courtroom, but would not strip the truth of its pain either. He was careful to remind her that a judicial process required evidence to be presented through witnesses and records, not through moral pleas. Paulo, the investigative reporter who had been nudged toward the story by a neighbor, was slower to arrive but crucial when he did. He was not a tabloid journalist. He worked for a small regional paper that valued depth. He called Maria to set a time and listened as she spoke in the same flat, exhausted way her life had taught her to speak. He asked for documents, for names, for the chronology. He did not promise headlines. He promised to verify and, if the facts held, to present them plainly. The first set of official sanctions came in the form of the manager's letter that severed Maria's hours entirely. "We are grateful," it said, "but your position is no longer tenable." The language tried to be gentle and professional. The effect was simple and brutal. A woman who had counted minutes in pesos would now count bills without the steady beat of a regular paycheck. The night she packed her cleaning supplies, Isabella wrapped a blanket and whispered, "Bring back the girl, a picture of the sun." Rodrigo pressed his face into her hand and said nothing. Maria's hands shook in the way of someone opening a lock after a long day. Losing her job did not erase the resolve that had brought her into the house at 3 a.m. If anything, it clarified the stakes. Without a salary, the risk expanded from 1 life to 3. Legal proceedings moved with the heavy gear of courts. Carla's requests led to a judicial hearing where a judge would consider the preliminary evidence and decide whether to remove the child from the mother's custody pending a fuller investigation. The courtroom smelled of paper and polish. Maria sat in the gallery, hands folded, listening to the rhythmic voice of the clerk. She felt both small and enormous. Small because in a room of lawyers, the truth had to be dressed in formalities. Enormous because the life of a child, one the size of a sunken chest, depended on the way words landed on a bench. Beatrice testified in a trembling voice that she had seen the mother shout once in private, that the adopted daughter had seemed thin and withdrawn. Her statements were careful and remembered in the low cadence of someone who feared being dragged back into the house's orbit. Dr. Marcello explained his interpretation of the notebook, patterns of confinement and exclusion consistent with enforced separation, heavy lines that suggested anxiety or fear. The pediatrician read parts of the medical report aloud. Weight below expected percentile, signs of chronic stress, healed bruises consistent with older trauma. Jorge explained the system's backups and the likelihood that footage for the relevant night had been recorded and preserved. And then the footage. When the defense objected, saying access to archived video might have been compromised, Raphael stood and asked the judge simply to admit the clip into evidence. "The question is not motive," he said. "The question is what the camera recorded and whether it corroborates the child's statements." The judge, after a long watchful look at Carla's file and the chain of custody documents Jorge had produced, allowed a controlled playback. No frame in that room was cinematic. The footage showed a dim corridor and a source of bright porch light at the threshold. It showed a small figure at the edge of a doorframe, and then the motion that was small and human and terrible. An adult figure closing a door and the child moving away, alone at the edge of the yard. The camera's timestamp read 2:45 a.m. It did not provide motive or explanation. It did not show forced physical harm in a salacious way. It showed instead the banality of neglect, a door sealing a child out into the cold, a private choice caught in the mechanical eye of a device. Silence in the room was heavy. The judge watched the screen, then looked at the medical report, then at the faces in the gallery. "On the basis of these records," she said, her voice even, "there is sufficient preliminary evidence to believe the child is at risk. I order protective measures to remove the child from the current custodial environment pending further investigation. I'm referring the matter to the appropriate public prosecutor for review." The decision did not announce guilt. It announced a protective threshold. The state, at least for a time, would act in loco parentis. The adopted daughter was placed temporarily in a foster home with Dona Lucia and Antonio, a modest couple who had retired and now volunteered for child respite services. The transfer was careful and conducted with a tenderness that suddenly felt like practical prayer. Maria stayed until the child had the new blanket in her lap, and the couple smiled with practiced ease to make the transition less terrifying. Enrique's reaction was delayed and complicated. For months, he had been distant, a hum in the background of family photos and social statements. The footage, the reports, and the judge's decision reached him in a different rhythm. Boardroom emails interrupted, a sonorous silence in his office that had no buffer. He met with a private counselor, and then for the first time he came to the clinical visits, looking as if he'd learned to be someone new. At first, Enrique's involvement was halting. It looked like awkward contrition, a man trying on the language of accountability. But when he saw the footage, when he sat in a small meeting room with Carla and Raphael and watched the timestamps, something in him changed in a way that was less about public image and more about a human undoing. He went to the foster house without cameras, without speeches, and asked very simply, "Can I speak to her?" Meeting a father who had been largely absent, the adopted daughter recoiled and then softened. She knew the sound of men with briefcases. She knew the way apologies could arrive with satin. Enrique did not demand immediate forgiveness. He asked only for the chance to be present in a way that he had not been before. The court, mindful of the child's stability, allowed supervised visits and ordered a comprehensive family assessment. The prosecutor opened a formal investigation into Gabriela's conduct. The legal process ahead was uncertain and real, and the door to criminal consequence had been cracked open but not yet closed. The family's PR tried to spin. They declared a commitment to family unity and to privacy. They suggested the public should wait for complete facts. The smear campaign that had targeted Maria now sputtered and shifted as the judge's decision and the footage circulated beyond the echo chambers. Paulo's article, carefully written and sourced, anchored the narrative in facts and avoided the sensational. He described Maria as an ordinary woman who had done the extraordinary thing of persisting and documented the chain of evidence in a way that the public could follow. The piece asked readers to consider what felt like a radical normality, that ordinary people could hold power accountable. Public opinion began to flicker. Some voices still argued the family's case. Others recognized the pattern of invisibility that wealth can create. The online vitriol that had accompanied Maria's firing found itself, in some quarters, replaced by messages of support. Small donations from neighbors arrived in envelopes with "thank you" written in handwriting that meant more than money could. A solidarity for a woman who had risked her livelihood to make a child safe. The trial that followed months later was a slow legal waltz of testimony and cross-examination. The defense argued for context and for the possibility of misinterpretation. They questioned the continuity of the footage and suggested the bruises might have other explanations. They attempted to make the adopted daughter's memories seem unreliable, as if a child's fog could be recast as an imagined narrative. Raphael and Carla worked in counterpoint, assembling a narrative that relied not on melodrama, but on corroboration, medical records, psychological interpretation of the drawings, Jorge's confirmation of archival authenticity, Beatrice's testimony about a pattern, and the footage's timestamp. The adopted daughter's testimony was careful and guided through a child-friendly room rather than on a formal stand. Her words were short, clear, and careful. "I was left outside," she said, the words small and deliberate. "I was cold. I tried to knock, but the door was closed." The way she said closed was a tiny, decisive sound in the room. It was not a dramatic confession. It was an account of what had been. When the judge read the decision, not an absolute end, but a ruling that recognized the child's safety as paramount, the relief that followed was complicated. The court ordered continued protective custody while the criminal investigation proceeded. Gabriela faced charges of neglect and coercion of a minor, investigations that could lead to prosecution depending on how the evidence was weighed. The law's wheels turned slowly. Justice sometimes arrives in pieces. For Maria, the verdict was less about triumph and more about a cautious easing. She had lost her job, been vilified, seen her children bear the cost of judgment. Yet a life had been stabilized. The adopted daughter, now under the care of Dona Lucia and Antonio in a small house with curtains that smelled of lavender, began to receive the kind of steady interventions that make repair possible. Weekly sessions with Dr. Marcelo, play therapy that allowed her to build trust through toys and not just testimony, and stable meals served at regular times. The therapy did not erase what had happened. It made space for language to get less jagged and for joy to arrive in small increments. The adopted daughter started tentatively to draw again, but this time the drawings included hands reaching out of doors, yes, but also windows with light and a figure standing outside who had a smile. Once she drew a picture of a yard with a sun and two figures holding hands. The therapist did not interpret that as a cure. She spoke of it as a hopeful indicator. Enrique's involvement deepened in a way that suggested a real change. He sold some properties quietly, redirected philanthropic resources into local child protection charities, and attended parenting classes alongside the therapeutic mandates the court required. The transformation was uneven. Abrupt change rarely resolves old deficits overnight, but it was visible and mattered to a child who, perhaps for the first time, saw the possibility of a man who would show up. Maria's life adjusted as well. She did not return to the mansion. Her dignity, once tied to a predictable schedule of work, found new shapes. A local NGO that supported whistleblowers and abused children invited her to speak. They wanted to pay her in a way that was not tokenistic, a stipend, work helping other families with grassroots documentation, and a role in a program that trained domestic workers to recognize signs of harm and to report them safely. Maria, who had never imagined herself an advocate, found that her story gave others permission to act. Recognition, when it came, was awkward and modest. The city gave a small ceremonial award to community leaders who had acted to protect children. Maria stood beside professionals and volunteers and received a plaque. The cameras flashed briefly. The philanthropic photo that Gabriela had once issued had its mirror image now, a woman whose life was ordinary becoming extraordinary by her insistence. Maria accepted the attention, not because she wanted it, but because it could be used to widen the circle of care. The family's legal entanglement did not evaporate. Gabriela fought the charges, and the public saw the messy outlines of a legal fight that would probably drag on in fissures and appeals. The story did not end neatly with a guilty verdict and a lesson learned. It ended, more realistically, with a change of custody and the beginning of a long, slow healing process in which the adopted daughter would have the space to become a person whose past no longer dictated every future moment. Years later, when the adopted daughter was old enough to volunteer at a small shelter for children in transition, she chose, without pomp, to teach art classes. She drew with hands that had once made closed doors into lines and now made open landscapes instead. Maria came sometimes to the shelter, not as a saint, but as a woman who had been hardened and softened by the same seasons. They would sit at the end of the table and watch as children smudged charcoal and laughed. At home, Rodrigo and Isabella had grown into young people who knew their mother as someone who had risked losing comfort for the sake of a stranger. They told friends the story less as a boast than as a fact of family history. Rodrigo kept a small stone in his pocket, a pebble from the yard where Maria had first found the child, and where she had stood in a cardigan and a resolve that had nothing showy about it. Isabella once found a drawing tucked into a book Maria kept and held it up. A sun, a door, and two hands linking. She smiled, a slow, stunned smile that acknowledged the cost and the grace of the thing they had been part of. The adopted daughter kept one object as a token of her survival. A folded page from the early notebook, the one that had been hidden under a dresser and then carried in Maria's bag. It was less an artifact of pain than a map of triumph. Small lines that had become proof. She kept it in a shoebox in her bedroom, alongside cards from therapists that encouraged small acts of resilience. Maria continued to help other domestic workers learn how to document signs in ways that would be admissible if needed, how to make safe calls to authorities, how to protect themselves from retaliation. She worked with a lawyer who had seen how power shields itself and who aimed to create small legal templates that low-income workers could use to protect children when they saw harm. The work was slow and often thankless, but it had a rhythm that suited her, small acts that accumulated into systems. At community meetings, she would sometimes say something simple. If you see something, tell someone. If you can't risk it alone, find someone who will stand with you. She said it not as a sermon, but as a tactical lesson. The crowd would applaud politely, then go home to lives that were complicated in their own ways. The adopted daughter's future remained deliberately unglamorous. She grew into a young woman who chose to study social work, in part because she wanted to be a presence for children who could not name what was happening to them. She volunteered at the same clinic where Dr. Marcello had once sat and looked at her drawings, and she learned to listen in a way that acknowledged how small words can hold large truths. She did not show all her scars in public. She did not allow her story to become someone else's spectacle. She chose instead to use what she had been given: time, steady meals, therapy, and the presence of people who had refused to look away. In quiet moments, Maria would visit a small mural painted in the neighborhood near the shelter, a son with hands stretching out of a door, a child sitting under it like a promise. The mural had been painted by several of the kids who had been through the program and a visiting artist who volunteered. People left tokens at its base sometimes, a stone, a drawing, a note that said, "Thank you." Maria once left, tucked under the mural's corner, a photo she had taken years before of a small pair of pajamas folded on a sofa, the same pajamas the adopted daughter had worn the first night she had found her. It was a private relic of a public decision. Not everything was resolved. Gabriella's name remained in newspapers in relation to a legal fight. Some people continued to sympathize with the idea that mistakes are not crimes. The law does not always satisfy the wish for perfect retribution, but at the level that mattered most, a child who could now sleep in a room with a lock that kept her in and not out, a woman who could pay her rent and teach others how to be brave, the outcomes were real. One evening, years after that night on the lawn, Maria walked across the park where she had once sat, holding the notebook like a small, brittle Bible. The adopted daughter, now grown, had stopped by with a small bundle, a postcard, a charcoal sketch, and a sun hat. She had come not as a famous survivor, but as a person who carried the ordinary dignity of someone who had chosen a life of care. They sat on a bench that smelled faintly of the city and the rain that had once washed the mansion's stones. The adopted daughter reached into her pocket, unfolded a page, one that showed a door with a figure outside and another figure reaching a hand, and handed it to Maria. "For the night you knocked on the door," she said. Her voice was steady, adult, threaded with a soft gratitude that had no need for grand language. Maria's eyes blurred, but she did not call it tears. She took the page and folded it carefully as if handling a relic. She kept it in her wallet for years after, not to show off, but to remember the shape a life can take when someone decides not to walk away. The city kept moving. Houses continued to have polished facades. People curated lives that could be composed for cameras and speeches. But in small corners, a bench, a community clinic, a mural, well, something else took root. The knowledge that ordinary people could hold power to account, that the language of evidence and the stubbornness of care can intersect to protect someone who cannot protect herself. The last thing Maria saw before she closed the shoebox that held the old notebook pages was a small drawn sun in the upper corner. It was not bright enough to erase the past, but it was a light. She placed the shoebox on a shelf and for a long time after would sometimes run her finger over the folded edge of that page and remember a cardigan wrapped around small shoulders on a cold lawn at 3 a.m. If you carry one thing away from this, let it be less about who won or lost and more about perhaps the simplest human idea. If you see someone small and cold at the edge of your life, you can choose to warm them. It is rarely easy. It often costs. It almost always changes you. If you can, stay awake for that moment. If this story moved you or reminded you of someone who needs a hand, subscribe to the channel and consider looking up local child protection resources in your area. Your attention can make space for someone else to be safe.